Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us to listen to this discussion about this topic. You may have noticed I instinctively went to one side of the seat because I'm usually one of the people who is talking about it, who is discussing it and engaging in vigorous debate. But today I've been asked to take a more of a moderator role, so which is why I'm sitting in the middle. But the Uniform Civil Code, as Sunaina just mentioned, is something that has been part of the debate. Yes, it feels like since last year or a couple of years, but in fact, it has been something which has been debated for a much longer period of time. It was a key demand of the women's movement even before independence. It's something that finds mention in our constitution. It was even vigorously debated then. Those of you who have read the Constituent Assembly debates or have the context on this will know that there was fierce disagreement on why we need to have a uniform civil code. So it ended up in Article 44 of the Constitution, which directs the state to try and create one at some point. But here is where perhaps we see the Constitution, in one rare occasion, speaking in multiple contradictory voices. You have Article 44, as I just mentioned, which talks about creating a uniform civil code at some point of time. You also have the fact that personal laws, family laws, which are covered within a uniform civil code, are in the concurrent list, which means both the union and the state government can pass laws on this topic. So the constitution itself doesn't seem to be very sold on the idea of uniformity. Likewise, we have exclusions for areas in the fifth schedule, which relate to Adivasi communities living in the Chota Nagpur Plateau area, and also for certain states in the northeast where you can't apply centrally made laws uniformly to them without the consent of the governor or the people in that state. So this is one issue where the constitution genuinely has different voices about. There has been a huge debate about the desirability of uniformity. On the one hand, there is this point of view that uniformity promotes justice. Why should it be that your rights as a woman or as a man in personal law depends on the religion that you follow? And it seems to be the most straightforward thing, especially since the Constitution guarantees in Article 15 that there shall be no discrimination on the basis of religion when you are talking about equal protection of law. Why is it that personal laws have different provisions for people depending on their religion? But on the other hand, you have this inherent acknowledgement of India's diversity running through the Constitution, which says that maybe there is not a one size fits all solution to India's myriad problems, and maybe a one size fits all solution to personal laws perhaps doesn't exist. This is a debate which I think tends to get polarized along partisan lines, maybe for good reasons, maybe for not. But what we hope to do today, and what we hope you will take away at the end of this, is not that we're not trying to get Raag or Madhu to convince anyone that exactly one position is absolutely right. But whatever your views on this particular topic, you will understand the complexities and the nuances of it. That you will see that anybody who tries to tell you uniform civil code, good or bad, is perhaps unnecessarily simplifying what is a difficult issue to grapple with, what is at sometimes a very divisive issue, but perhaps something that we need to debate, we need to discuss. And I say debate, I don't mean the TV anchor kind. I mean the one where we genuinely try to understand the other's position and see how we can reframe our position appropriately, how we can change our thinking appropriately, so that we find a way forward, that we're not stuck in partisan positions about this issue. So, giving that very broad outline, giving that very broad scope of what we're going to do, what we proposed and what we have discussed is initially I will invite Raag and Madhu to give a brief overview of their take on the Uniform Civil Code, its necessity, its constitutionality, among other things. And then what I propose to do is to dive deep into some of the specific points that they talked about. Specifically, for instance, what does the women's movement have to say about this? how does it help how does it help or harm marginalized communities if we were to think of a uniform civil code, and how do we try and square the circle when it comes to the constitution's somewhat conflicting ideas about the uniform civil code. And finally, maybe, and this is where I'll try and invite their points of view on this, is uniformity necessary for justice, right? So, Rag, let me just sort of start with you in terms of what would be your take very broadly on the need for an UCC. What could be the potential process by which it is made, and the idea itself, what could be the potential constitutional concerns with it?
So, like Alok was saying, I was in Uttarakhand a couple of weeks ago, and I was having a discussion with a lawyer there. And so I asked him, what's your view on the UCC? And he said something along the lines of that there are two kinds of people who can give simple answers: sages and asses. And he said, none of us are sages, and we're all trying very hard not to be asses. So Alok's asked a very easy question, but I don't have a simple answer. But what I'll just try and do is I'll lay my cards on the table just up front, and then I'll try and lay out what are the issues I think that are involved. So I think a UCC is a good idea, but the Uttarakhand UCC was a rather dull, unimaginative, cumbersome exercise that has caused more heat than light for reasons that maybe we can go into. Insofar as the UCC or the idea of the UCC itself is concerned, so Article 44 of the Constitution says that the state shall endeavor to have a uniform civil code. The first point is India already has a uniform civil code. We have a uniform civil code when it comes to everything except personal laws. We all drove here today. We followed the same traffic regulations. We have the same financial regulations. We have the same building codes. All aspects of our civil lives are common except for personal laws. And this was an idea actually that when you read the Constituent Assembly debates, in fact, when you read those debates, you realize that not much has changed in 75 years. And these issues were actually litigated with greater patience and nuance in the assembly than they are today. Ambedkar had clarified this point that if you don't want a uniform civil code, you're about 100 years too late. The question is simply, do we now extend it to personal laws given the religious sensitivities of the time? Now, in 1948, when this debate was being had, everyone, Hindu, Muslim, everyone agreed in the Constituent Assembly, this is not the time to consider this question. At this time, it's a religious tinderbox. So let's park this question for the future. And the governments of the day can revisit it as and when the time comes. So there is a constitutional sanction for the UCC, and there was an amendment, in fact, 3 amendments proposed by 3 different Muslim members during the Constituent Assembly, saying that Article 44, which was then draft Article 35, should exclude personal laws. They wanted that explicit assurance that this uniform civil code idea does not extend to personal laws. The very same arguments that we hear today, that there are religious sensitivities in the country, there is a right to practice, propagate your religion, and so on and so forth. So let the state not interfere with these religious matters. These amendments were rejected. So quite clearly, the idea of the Constituent Assembly was that a future state can, if it wants, legislate a UCC in respect of personal laws, but we don't want to bind them to what we think right now. Let those matters proceed, right? So insofar as is there a constitutional sanction for the UCC? My answer, based on the reading of history and the legal text, is a simple yes. But that's just the legal mandate. Now, should we do it? Should we not do it? I don't want to take too much time up at the beginning. So what I'll just try and do is, I think there are 3 different issues that are involved here. And we would do well to de-link each of the 3 issues. The 3 issues are, there is a justice issue, there is a uniformity issue, and then there is a religious issue. Alok just began by saying that uniformity is about justice. I'm going to differ with him there. The justice argument is very clear. Justice argument is saying that in any personal law, Hindu, Muslim, Parsi, Christian, if there are some elements whereby someone's rights are being violated, someone is being a constituency or class of people, women, children, anyone, is being treated unfairly, then the state can enter, legislate, and correct that injustice. So we can have a justice argument, amend different personal laws, and yet not have a uniform civil code, right? This is what, for example, we did in, for example, in the triple talaq Shaira Bano case. They said that this is a particular injustice, which the Supreme Court said we are going to remedy, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the idea that a UCC is required, right? And justice arguments are constitutionally well grounded. You read, for example, Article 25 of the Constitution, it says that the right to freedom to practice, propagate your religion is subject to the other rights in Part 3 of the Constitution, that is, your fundamental rights, right? Article 25 2b again clarifies that religious aspects, secular aspects of religion can be legislated upon. So just because you put a religious card on the table doesn't mean that that's the end of the argument. It's the beginning of the argument, right? So I think there is a good justice argument to be made, but that justice argument is not a UCC argument. The UCC argument is the second one on uniformity, and the idea there is very simple. We are citizens first, Hindu, Muslims, Christians second. We have, in the afternoon, I went through this wonderful exercise of collating all the personal laws. I went up till 14 and about 55 different customs. If I were to read through it, it would take up a lot of the session. So the idea is, listen, this is getting a bit too much. If you are Parsi, then the Part A of the Indian Succession Act 1925 applies. But if you are a Parsi married to a non-Parsi, then Part B applies. If you're a Christian, Part B applies. If you are a intestate, if you are a Hindu, the Hindu Succession Act applies. Unless and until you marry under the Special Marriages Act, then something else applies. If you are Muslim uncodified personal law through the 1937 Shariat Act applies, unless, of course, there is custom and usage to the contrary, and so on and so on and so on. So the idea is, let's come together on these matters. Let's have a simple, clean, clear, efficient code that's easy to administer. Beyond that, you have the right to religious diversity, pluralism, and all of those things. The UCC simply regulates certain civil aspects when we have to engage with the state on matters of succession, estate administration, marriage, divorce, adoption, and guardianship, right? Beyond these, your religious freedom is not affected by the UCC in any way. Yeah, sorry. And finally, and I'll end with this, there is a third argument, which is the argument I am most concerned with, which was not mentioned in the introduction, which is there is a religious argument for the UCC. And this argument was articulated again in the Constituent Assembly debates there was a lawyer, K.M. Munshi, is a very famous constitutional lawyer. And he argued when the various Muslim members were saying, listen, let's park this subject on the side for a moment. And I'm quoting him, he said, what does any of this have to do with religion? And the argument he was making there was that there is the substance of the religion, which is what really matters, which is, questions of how should I live, what should I do, what form of worship should I consider, what are the ethical, metaphysical questions, my relationship to God, to reality, and all of those things. He said those are the crucial aspects of religion. And then there are the mutable or changing aspects of religion, right? Which change with time, circumstance, and geography to suit whatever society requires that day, at that time. And so he said, let us delink what is the spiritual core of religions from what is the more outer mundane concern with respect to the administration of estates, legal rights and duties, etc. Let those be subject to a public debate, to a debate that is inclusive and just. But he asked, is this the definition of religion that we want to take as a starting point for having this debate, right? I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I'll just give you a quick example. I was a witness to a friend's marriage, and he got married under the Hindu Marriage Act 1955 or 56. So you have to go to the registrar's office, you have to take a date and all. So we went there, and then there's a form that you have to sign, and that form said, I am above the age of 21, I am of sound mind, which he may not have been at the time, bunch of these different things. I'm not previously married. Then it said, I hereby affirm and declare that I am a Hindu. So I asked my friend, boss, you're signing your name onto this. What does this mean? And his answer is very clear. He says, I can get married under the Special Marriage Act, which is the religion agnostic law. But there, once you file an application, there is a 1 month notification waiting period, which is problematic for a different reason. So I'm going to have to come back in 1 month. So what made my friend Hindu, and it's anecdotal, is that he wanted to avoid 1 hour of Delhi traffic. Right? Now, I'm not saying that everyone is as religiously illiterate as him, bless his soul. But I think we need a deeper discussion when we speak of the right to religious freedoms about what it is exactly that we are speaking about, that we are asserting this constitutional right about. It's not a legal question, but I think it's a cultural question, which is the root cause of some of these concerns. And unless and until we address that fraught question, and it is a fraught question, these subsequent problems of the mechanics of what should the succession law be, and so on and so forth, will provide temporary relief, but we're not going to get to the bottom of the problem. So I'm going to stop there, and maybe we can revisit some of these questions.
Thanks a lot, Raag. And I'd just like to take on one of the points that Raag made at the end, and I'm hoping Madhu you will expand on it. And we discussed this before this. While of course you need to discuss your position on the UCC, I suppose somewhere we have all assumed that the state should necessarily regulate all personal laws. If we look at Indian history, it's actually a very recent phenomenon, right? The state has regulated a lot of things, has taxed a lot of things, but personal laws, it is something that it kind of stayed away. Even the British regime, except for saying this one thing is outlawed or that one thing is not permitted, didn't really want to get into this till very end. So somewhere I would like you to kind of, perhaps based on your experience also, like how should we understand engaging with the state on questions of legal reform, and especially in the context of the UCC?
Yeah, thank you, Alok. And thank you to BIC for organizing this debate on this very, very contentious issue, which of course, I think comes up regularly, every couple of years it comes up and then everybody gets into this huge, dizzy. But first of all, let me confess that I feel at a total disadvantage because I have two gentlemen who are, who are lawyers and I'm the illegal one, the activist. So I am not starry-eyed about the law at all. I have, we have a lot of problems with the law. It seems very neat and clean. Yes, the Uniform Civil Code, bingo. Women have justice, equality, etc. No, life is not like that. And I come from the women's movement where we deal not only with law, we are engaging with the law, but more than the law, we're engaging with life. And we see the messy intersections that are there between law and life. So whatever I say regarding the Uniform Civil Code will really come from that experience of dealing with life and law. So it's really from there that I will be speaking, and from my experience in the women's movement, because I've been around in the movement for more than 40 years, and I think we've been at the, at every major, what can I say, upsurge that was there. We were there at the center of it and taking very different positions because we have changed. We have changed from wanting a UCC in the 80s to saying no to a UCC to whatever position that we hold today. And there are reasons why we do that. Because like I said, it's not as neat and clean as having a law, but really saying what works on the ground. What is it that works on the ground? And also this whole thing of the UCC. You think like UCC is like this panacea for all ills, that is being pushed. Saying that, why on earth, like as Raag you were saying, it's so messy. Religion is so messy. Everything is so messy. I have this law that, that anyway you have a uniform law that deals with taxation, etc., etc. Why is it so difficult? Yes, exactly. We need to ask the question, why is it so difficult to address what issues? Because what are the issues that the UCC is addressing? It is addressing issues related to marriage, family. Okay, and these for me are far more contentious, than a UCC. I think it raises great disquiet and, discomfort in many people. Oh, incidentally, another discomfort I really did want to, articulate right in the beginning is that apart from the fact that, it's heavy with lawyers and one non-lawyer, I really wish I think this debate would have benefited if we had people, who have really contributed in very rich ways to to this whole debate. Okay, apart from the women's movement, we've had, women's groups from the Muslim, communities and from the Christian communities who've engaged with the personal laws and with the UCC. I think we would have benefited greatly from having, because this is not a diverse panel. I'm sorry, it's really unfortunate, but this is not a diverse panel. I wish we had, women from the Muslim and the Christian communities who have really engaged with these things on the ground in their lives and, in their communities. And I think that would have brought in a richness. I think another layer would have been brought in if we had, representatives of movements of the sexual minorities. Because I think in recent times, that is another community that has really, really brought a lot of nuance to this whole demand, for changes in the law. I wouldn't say just UCC, but changes, because we're finally, what are we talking about? We're talking of legal reform, and legal reform related to marriage and family. Okay, this is what essentially we are talking about, and I think these are groups that have really had. So it's unfortunate that we do not have that, and yeah. So I just wanted to flag that issue, because I feel uncomfortable, representing all those voices, because these are voices that we have engaged with in the women's movement. We've kind of really sat and we try to be inclusive of, different segments who are impacted, different communities who are impacted. So yes. So now it's a burden on me to kind of carry that. But anyway, I'm here, so let me do that. Yeah. So what I do, yes, I'm glad you raised this whole issue of, what is the relationship with the state, because I think legal reform is the department of the state, right? And like I said, in the 80s, we had this great faith in the state. Okay, in the women's movement, we had a great faith in the state. And why? Because we felt that society was too patriarchal. Because we felt that, society, social processes, communities, families, these are all patriarchal institutions. They are not going to give us justice, especially when it comes to marriage and divorce, or maintain, a family, marriage, divorce, custody, all these host of issues. We are not going to get justice from these very patriarchal institutions. So it's the state, that's going to give us. State is secular. State is, it looks after everybody, especially the marginalized. The constitution is there, so we can go to the state for justice. So this was a very, starry-eyed kind of thing that we had in the 80s. So I guess because we were so fed up with, dealing with patriarchy within our homes and within our communities, we said we should reach out to the state. So that was the starting point with our, with saying that we need a uniform civil code, perhaps, that would deliver us from all these kind of ills that we are facing. But I just, before I get to the state, I do want to say that this whole UCC debate has also, or at least our engagement with it has been, I would say there are three major threads, that I would disentangle in this whole knot. Okay, one is the ideological, or what we don't want it to be. The other is the idealistic viewpoint of what it should be. And the other is the pragmatic of what it can be. Okay, and I think we have been dealing in the women's movement, and those of us, like I said, who are dealing with law and life, we're dealing with an unholy mixture of all the three, ideological, the idealistic, and the pragmatic. Okay, what is possible and what is not possible. So when you look at this, when you say state, I would link it to the ideological thread. Okay, because where is it coming from? Where is it? It is coming really from the state. So it's good that you brought up this whole issue of the Constituent Assembly debates, and that yes, it goes back actually to the British times also, when the British first started interfering with the personal law. So maybe we can go a little bit of flashback. I just want to highlight a few kind of points. The turning points, I would say, which have impacted on the course of this whole debate. So I would look at, if you look at the state, I would look at the state first as the colonial state and its imperative of colonialism. I mean, that was its whole intent, right? Empire building. It was imperative, the colonial state and the imperative of empire building. Then in the next phase would be the post-independent state and the imperative of nation building. And then, of course, you have post that, I'm just fast forwarding, and then you have the globalized state, the post-90s, which is when the debate also became very, very contentious and very vitiated, more than it was earlier in the 90s, which was the globalized state and the imperative of cultural nationalism, because that is where we saw both these threads coming together of, you had the globalized state with, bringing with 90s, the opening up of the economy. And then you had the whole demolition of the Babri Masjid. And so, Hindutva kind of thing coming in, because UCC is also linked up with, when you say religion, it's not just the religion of the minorities, but it's also the religion of the majority. So it's both. So this is the kind of state, if we have to look at the state, I would say we need to see how have these three kinds of states really dealt with this issue. Okay, so very quickly, when the British, like I said, were the first ones, as he also mentioned, they were the first ones who tried the codification of the personal laws. And like Raag tried miserably today of putting together the personal laws. And by the way, it's not just personal laws. You'll also have customs. You'll also have customary practices, etc., etc. It's a huge, it's a maze. Okay, so but the British, tried to codify it. They tried to codify it, and of course they were a bit careful because it's to do with culture. It's to do with the personal realm of the family, and they don't want to touch all that. It's easier to deal with crime. It's easier to deal with tax. It's easier to deal with all these. That's why it's far more easier to deal with all this. This is all very messy, right? So they didn't want to kind of touch too much on it. So who did they depend on? But they needed to, because they have to control this population that's so, bizarre and, all over the place. So you need to bring in some order. So who did they depend on to kind of codify these laws? Because you think that it's personal laws versus UCC, but actually it is not. I wouldn't see it as personal laws versus UCC at all, because I think they're two sides of the same coin, because both the personal laws and the UCC, in fact, they're a form of legislated uniformity, both. Both of them are a form of legislated uniformity that places precept over practice, text over context, law over life, homogeneity over pluralism, and social engineering over social transformation. Okay, so for me, both the personal laws and the UCC do this. And why do I say this? And I think the seeds for this were laid during the colonial state, when the British tried to kind of bring the personal laws together. And how do they do this? Who did they consult? They consulted first of all the male leaders. Okay, they didn't sit and talk, have lots of conversations with women. How is this affecting you? No. They went straight to the top men, and they were the men in power. So they were, whether it was the Hindu, pundits, or whether it was the Maulvis, they were all from the more dominant sects. Like even in the Islamic this thing, they didn't refer to everybody. Islam also has so many sects, but they also referred only to the dominant sect. So they only refer to the pundits, the Brahminical priests, and the Maulvis, who were on top of the social and religious hierarchy, and they did their own translation of the practices. They decided, because it's all nothing is written in stone, right? So they have to depend on the interpretation of these men in power. So those are the laws that are taken. And then they're translated and interpreted by the colonial guys, okay, with their own ideas of Orientalism and what, Indian and Hindu and Muslim practices are. So you see, nothing is written. These are all interpretations. These are not, they're not edicts that have come down from heaven. Okay, so now you have different levels of distortion and interpretations, and these become codified as personal laws that we are all sitting and fighting about today, like as if they've been so immutable, which they have not. Okay, so that is one part of the story. So at that time, of course, many things got left out of the whole process. Like, they didn't look at, and like I said, women's point of view was not considered at all. Women's realities were not considered. It was just how do you kind of tie these up into neat kind of, okay, Muslim personal law, Hindu personal law, so they have these kind of neat little pockets that were tied up at great cost, and what was happening under that, nobody even wanted to open and see. Then you have I'm just going very, fast forwarding, because many things, actually it's very interesting if you look at it, because in this whole process, like for example, like when I say interpretation of the colonial mindset, you have something called the restitution of conjugal rights, which is the most ridiculous provision that is there in the law. Now, what is restitution of conjugal rights? You'll have heard of it, right? You haven't? Okay, you must, because it's a hilarious, thing that is there, and it's come down to us, courtesy the British, because it was there in, the English matrimonial statutes. And what is it? It means that that means you can go to court, literally, put it in very crass terms. You can go to court to say, my wife is not sleeping with me. or my husband is not sleeping with me. So I want the court to direct my partner to sleep with me. Essentially, isn't that? I mean, am I right? Can I ask the
Yeah,
lawyers, please?
that's
Okay.
entirely fine.
So this is the bare bone kind of. So can you imagine some ridiculous this thing like this? And this was come from the colonial. Now that gets put into our legal framework. Whereas there were some practices like stridhan, which are actually the women's right to property within the matrimonial home, that was done away with. Okay, so it was all very arbitrary. It was absolutely arbitrary. So you had all kinds of interpretations coming into this. So there was this whole process of homogenization and hegemonization that had already happened in this period of the colonial state. So you had hegemonization from outside, so you had a colonial interpretation, and you had homogenization from within, which was in conformity with the dominant sections within Hindu, Muslim, whatever other personal laws. So that is as far as colonial state is concerned. Now you come to the independent state. Okay, another very interesting phenomena. I think the constituent I have read, though I'm not a lawyer, I have gone through some of the Constituent Assembly debates, especially those related to this, and I find them fantastic. It's very rich actually. You read it and you see the kind of pushes and pulls. I think it's very, very fantastic. It was a very exciting process. You're creating a new country, so you're kind of laying out a new framework for the country, etc. But then we see that in those debates, the same old colonial and pre-colonial fault lines that were there are very much there even in those debates. So like as he already said, like for example, today Hindu personal law is seen as, the Hindu code bill, is supposed to be the kind of best, is supposed to be the model. But first of all, there's a lot of flaws with it even today. And at that time, for the Hindu code bill to come about, it was not easy at all. And you had this, let me just quote from you, this Patabi Sitaramaya, who was the president of Congress, okay? And he called the Hindu code bill, which was introduced in 1944, as anti-Hindu and anti-India. Sounds familiar, right? So he called it anti-Hindu and anti-India, in which, and this was, of course, as you said, it was pushed by the women, and it was women cutting across all parties. Women cutting across all parties wanted the Hindu code bill, and this was resisted by the Congress. President of the Congress, Patabi Sitaramaya, who said that he called it the tyranny of women. Okay, and he regretted that half a dozen lady members can drag us by our heels and make us take up the bill. Okay, I think he would have been made the president of Save the Indian Family today if he was there. Okay, and then of course on the other side, this was not just a Hindu thing. This was there. This resistance was there across. There was across the board. There was a resistance. From the Muslim League, from the Sikhs. There was resistance to this idea. And again, I want to quote this again. This is from a Sikh. A very emotional appeal was made by a Sikh, saying the honorable members should place themselves in the position of the minorities and then try to appreciate their fears. Sir, I may be accused of communalism when I sound this discordant note, but I hold that this nationalism is an argument for vested interests. Even the aggressiveness of the majority would pass off as nationalism, while the helplessness of minority may be dubbed as communalism. Okay, so one more little thread which I think has not changed, from then to now. And of course, you had K.M. Munshi, as he referred to, who was taking this, this moral high ground to say that, that we need to, we want to divorce religion from personal law, from what may be called social relations. One of the factors that has kept India back from advancing to nationhood, that has been the existence of personal laws that has kept the nation divided into watertight compartments. So, okay, so you had all these different, points of view in the Constituent Assembly debates. And mind you, both sides of this nationalism debate holds true. I mean, you can't, really dump both of them because there is the need to build a so-called united India on the one side. And there is also the need to retain the plural and diverse nature of our culture. And unfortunately, whether we like it or not, the realm of the family, marriage and all is part of this whole cultural, it's of this cultural mess. Okay, it is. But then again, unfortunately, that in this battle of nationalism versus cultural pluralism, this is always played out on the lives and bodies of women. Invariably, it's the women who have to it's on their bodies and their lives and their realities that this whole thing gets played out. And especially in the realm of, as I said, marriage and family, that is a holy cow for men across communities. None of the men across communities want to touch it. Okay, they don't want to touch marriage, and I think that was not only there then, but it's also there today. I think we can come to it when we talk about this thing. So then I'll just end up with the post-nationalist globalized state and the imperatives of cultural nationalism, because that is the context. Post-90s, I think that has been the framework. Okay, cultural nationalism. Why are we all so worried? Like earlier, we were not worried about the UCC. We wanted the UCC to kind of, but then once the right-wing BJP, Hindutva party took it up with missionary zeal, and made it very clear that they wanted to be a cornerstone of this grand Hindu Rashtra that they wanted to build. So then uniformity became more than just a simple, innocuous kind of thing that all of us want. Yeah, what's wrong with uniformity? But here, it's not just uniformity. It's politically loaded uniformity, okay? Because uniformity is not uniformity per se. It's not as innocent as it looks, but it is really majoritarianism that gets packaged and sold through this thing. So what we saw was, of course, that we saw this resurgence of culture of Hindutva nationalism, and for us in the women's movement, this phase, of the Indian state, vis-a-vis the UCC at least, was inaugurated with the Shah Banu judgment. Okay, the Shah Banu judgment and the reversal of it by Rajiv Gandhi, of the Rajiv Gandhi Congress government. I don't know how many of you have heard about the Shah Banu judgment. You have, right? Okay, very simply, it was years of fighting for justice for some meager 67 rupees or some nonsensical figure of a maintenance, that Shah Banu had filed, and it came up to the Supreme Court, and finally she, so it had gone up, right, all the way to Supreme Court, and it was countered, saying that, why this comes within the realm of personal laws, so maintenance cannot be granted, etc. So anyway, there's a whole lot of issues around that. The Supreme Court came down very strongly on that, and they made a big. It was Chandrachud, yes. So he came down and he said why the need for uniforms. He gave a long kind of thing about the rationale for uniform civil code, which was problematic. I think it was because it almost seemed like, anyway, I will not go into that. But anyway, the push was for a uniform civil code. And like I told you, at that time, we wanted it. So we were all very happy, that the demand was made. And we were all very unhappy when Rajiv Gandhi, he reversed the whole thing. And then he said, no, no, no. And why did he reverse it? Because there was a huge backlash from the Muslim community. And here we were thinking, we are fighting for women's rights, etc. We are fighting for the Muslim women. And, we are the women's movement. We are fighting for the women's movement. And then when we saw hundreds and thousands of Muslim women who took to the streets, in Bombay, saying, we don't want this, it kind of made us stop short. Say, okay, what are we doing wrong? Why? Maybe, is there something wrong in the way that we're conceiving of it? Is there something wrong with our strategies? Why are we not able to, make ourselves understood to the women who don't seem to want the justice that we are fighting so hard for? Because this was arrogance with which we also, I would say, were doing our own activism. Okay, so that really pushed us to really think of our own stand and this thing on the UCC, given the changing nature of the state. Okay, so yeah, so this is the context.
Oh, thank you very much, Madhu, because I think it's very useful and puts in the historical perspective our ideas and approaches, and I think very well explains, because something I was going to come to, which is you have highlighted very well, which is the fact that the women's movement has changed its mind. And I think this is a very important point for us to consider when we are talking about the approach of the women's movement itself, or other various women's movements themselves, to the Uniform Civil Code over the years. And this is perhaps a key aspect in understanding this point. Something which Madhu mentioned, and Raag, I wanted to come in specifically on this. I remember when I was in law school, there is this, and I'm not exaggerating how thick the actual book is. It's called Maine's Hindu Law. It was written by the famous John Maine back in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And of course, it's been updated. I'm not reading an ancient text. It's been updated over the years. But the introduction still carries the original essay that Maine wrote as an introduction to his work on Hindu law. And he ends by saying that I cannot for the life of me imagine there will ever be a codified Hindu law. It's too complex, too difficult, too confusing, too contradictory to ever be codified. But 50 years or 55 years after Maine wrote this, we have codified Hindu law in the form of the four Hindu bills, with the Hindu Code Bill, which was passed as four different legislation. What is it, perhaps, that made this kind of, I'm not denying its controversiality, and I think Madhu went into great depth as to the kind of opposition it faced, the kind of controversies it ran into, and how eventually a watered down version of the ideal was passed. What does this experience of passing a Hindu code bill for all Hindus in India, at least, does that tell us something about the Uniform Civil Code?
First, just to say one thing in response to Madhu, which is I fully agree. We legalize and judicialize this debate far too much. We have to culturalize it far more. So, in terms of having a richer array of voices, I think she's absolutely right. This question of Hindu law, there is nothing particularly Hindu about what we call Hindu law. And let me just quickly tell you the history. I'll give you a potted history of it, just to get a sense of what is it that we're speaking about. There's this wonderful book, by the way, which I would recommend to anyone. It's written by this portly little fellow from Oregon in the US called Christopher Fleming, published by Oxford University Press. It's called Inheritance and Ownership in Sanskrit Jurisprudence. Came out a couple of years ago. It's the first and most comprehensive study of what is this Hindu law that we speak about. So let me just quickly run through it and then come to what is the present day, because unless you understand the root causes, it's hard to do this. What we call Hindu law emerges from a series of Sanskrit scholastic texts called the Dharma Smritis. These comprise documents called the Dharma Shastras, which are written in prose. You have things with names like Vasishtha, Gautama, Apastamba, and so on and so forth. And then post around the Mauryan time, you have texts called the Dharma Shastras, where you have names like, which are you have Manu, Yagnavalkya, etc. These were scholastic written texts. Now, these texts, and obviously there are all kinds of references to the epics when you go back and read some of those texts. Now, what is very interesting is if you read any of these texts, which if you value your time, you should not, they're very long, they contain two elements. A majority, 95% of the discussion is on metaphysical questions of what does it mean to own something? What is the nature of property? Things like this. 5% of it speaks to very practical, real political theory where it prescribes codes, injunctions, nibandhas, and so on and so forth, which actually speak to how you should organize yourself. Now, I'm speaking 5th century BCE to 5th century CE. Following this, you have a massive commentarial tradition. You have nibandhas, tikas, tattvas, all kinds of things. These are monographs, texts where people started writing commentaries on some of these prior texts, right? Most of these are also scholastic texts talking about these large metaphysical, philosophical questions. Now, this goes on, this evolution of so-called Hindu law, which was not called Hindu law then, it keeps going on. You have the introduction, for those who are familiar with Hindu theology, you have the introduction of Mimamsa texts, which is the interpretive tradition within Hinduism. You have Nyavya Nyaya, which is the logical tradition in Hindu texts. All of these are, again, I'm talking now, we come to 8th, 9th, 10th, 12th century. All of these are largely scholastic texts talking about these broad philosophical questions, right? Only a small part of it deals with the actual injunctions of who gets what, why, when, and how. And these, if you go through the historical record, changed constantly over time to respond to the particular circumstances that were prevailing. They were patriarchal in many situations. Then you had some fellow who was slightly more progressive in those times and changed that law. Like Madhu was saying, the customs were unimaginably diverse, right? Now, then we come, all of these texts are available. Then we come to the British time. Now, let me just quickly, so this is In 1772, Warren Hastings, the Governor General of Bengal, he created this thing called a plan for administration of justice for Bengal. And so he created these Diwani Adalats, Sadar Diwani Adalats, some of which still survive in some official courts in India today. And he had this. This was the key innovation. 1772 was when things changed. He said, in all suits regarding inheritance, marriage, caste, and other religious usages, the laws of the Quran with respect to the Muhammadans and the law of the Shastra with an E with respect to the Gentus with a double O shall be invariably adhered to. And this is when, if you are a bureaucratic state, you value efficiency over all things, whether it's the British or the modern bureaucratic state, for some good reasons and some bad ones. Then they approached the Pandits who were the experts in these scholastic traditions to try and reduce this. And this is Christopher Fleming, is an authority on this text, so I'll just read him. He says, the error of viewing the Dharma Shastras as a codification of Hindu law rather than a uniquely Shastric form of jurisprudence and philosophy is as old as the discipline of Western Indology. The core problem was that they were looking for something administratively easier. And so they took these vast philosophical texts with all kinds of nuance and they reduced them to a set of clear prescriptions that they could then administer. It doesn't end there. This then went through, the British had this liberal religious zeal. So then it went through a process of codification where liberal ideals were introduced, elements of Roman law were introduced, elements of utilitarian thinking were introduced. And after all of this massive change over more than 2 millennia, we end up with the Hindu Code Bill and which became the Hindu Marriage and Succession Act 1955, 1956, right? The person who recognized that there is not much Hindu in the Hindu Code Bill was none other than Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly debates, who was no admirer of Hinduism. And he resigned from Nehru's cabinet after he realized that this fellow is not going to do anything about it. So what we call Hindu law today is, at worst, it's Anglo-Hindu law, and at best, it's Dharma Shastric, Dharma Smritik, canon, Roman, utilitarian, liberal, justice-oriented Hindu law. And it still has its mistakes. Till 2005, women were not given rights in a Hindu undivided family to be a co-parson. So it's an evolving process. The simple point I want to make here is, and this is what I mentioned at the beginning, is we are often stuck today with, because of the political environment, with these rather crude debates where people associate Hindu law with some kind of a deep identity of Hinduism. One can have one's opinion, but at least we have to have some grounding in the historical record when we make that claim. And I, for the life of me, am unable to find one. I think that is one distinction that clearly needs to be made. The second, which is now I'm coming to Alok's question more directly, is, there was an argument made again in the Constituent Assembly debates. By the way, it's only about 15, 20 pages. So I would encourage you to please read that. It makes for wonderful reading. By the way, many members of the Constituent Assembly debates around that time had to climb over mobs and picket lines to enter the Constituent Assembly. So they were in no mood for religious reform. Imagine if you go to work and you have to climb over a mob to get there. So I think sometimes you're a bit harsh on the Constituent Assembly makers for not going that further step. I think they had a difficult job. Any blame is, I think, on us today. So there was a member called Aladi Krishnaswamy, again a lawyer. Sorry, just so happens we're all there everywhere. And he made this argument. He made it with good intentions, but it's made sometimes with bad intentions today. And it's an argument saying, listen, we are Hindus. We had our religious laws and our personal laws amended. Now you guys must get punished also. It's the most juvenile form of argument. I got a rap on my knuckles, my brother, you must also get a rap on your knuckles. Right? I don't think that argument deserves any intellectual attention. We have to fight it politically. But that kind of sentiment, coupled with this ossification of what we call Hindu law and combining it with a Hindu, some deeper identity, has been the entrenched state of this debate subsequently. Right? And then you have the events in Rajiv Gandhi, the Babri Masjid, and subsequently, and that debate has further gotten kind of entrenched in those forms. But if you look at the history, we look at the Constituent Assembly debates, we look at even quote unquote Hindu texts, that kind of delinking, I think, is a necessary prerequisite to get anywhere, right? So I think this movement when the Uttarakhand UCC was passed, one of the arguments made locally in Uttarakhand was that this is not a uniform civil code, this is a Hindu civil code which is universalized, applied to everyone, right? If you read the provisions of the Uttarakhand UCC, it is what is reflected is not Hindu personal law. What is reflected is this unique kind of combination of all of the different laws that we have gotten. So wherever we land up on this argument, I don't think we're going to get very far, like Madhu said, like Alok referred to, if we don't separate the question of a valid, justified religious identity that is protected under the Constitution and this ossified version of what we call Hindu personal law that we seem to relate back to this identity. Unless we carve out that divide, the politics of it is eventually going to be along these tiresome identity lines that we have now gotten used to. And so for me, as just to that history, I think, is often elided, but extremely important in just carving out that difference.
Thanks a lot, Rag. And I think this is where a key element of the UCC has caused this anxiety. And it goes back to something, Madhu, you said that religion is not just a set of beliefs, but also identity. And coming to the question of identity, I think something which is perhaps new or perhaps maybe it is more prominent this time around is this assertion of Adivasi identity in the context of the Uniform Civil Code. And the codified Hindu law expressly excludes scheduled tribe communities from the application of quote unquote Hindu law. But what does it tell us? Because the key here is there is a fear, perhaps, even among communities whom are otherwise thoughtlessly put in as Hindu, that we are different here. What is perhaps, I think, where I'm coming from is the idea that identity cuts across many different aspects. So, how do we kind of understand this anxiety about codification, specifically from the Adivasi?
Well, maybe I'd like to answer that not specifically in the context of the Adivasi community, but again, let me go back to how we, as women's groups, in the women's movement, how we try to engage with this whole issue of identities. Okay, be it Adivasi, be it Muslim, be it minorities, be it whatever. I think it's important to look at it in a broader context instead of just fixating it in this thing. And I think that is where perhaps a flexibility of groups of women's groups was, because once we realized that at that time, I just go back again to historical this thing to say that when we saw that the UCC, and once we also saw that the law itself is not going to really give us any law, whether it's secular or personal law, is really not going to give us justice for women the way that we expect it to. Okay, it's not. In real times, it's not. I mean, if Shabanu took years to get one maintenance order, and that's a secular law. Excuse me, it's not a personal law. Okay, it took her years. It took her decades to get a maintenance order for 67 rupees. Now, is that justice? So at that point, we also kind of backtracked. So, and I think that's important for me. Why do I share this? Because we also have to see what is the reality on the ground. Apart from looking at what the personal law says, what the Adivasi custom says, what is it that's happening on the ground? Because I think that on the one hand, as far as the UCC debate was concerned, I think at that time we did get into it, and we said we don't want we started saying we don't want a UCC the way it was being projected at that time, and we went by what V.R. Krishna in a way kind of I think summed it up at that time, where he said that he was at that time there was a proposal for an optional UCC. Okay, there was an so that those who don't want to be governed by their personal laws could seek. So that was one proposal that had come up, and in a way it was summed up by we I remember we also as a organization, we also said, yes, we should have an option, so because we want justice, we want an optional law to be there, but it can't be forced down because of the, kind of situation on the ground, because people are not going to take to it. And then you have the community that will become, very defensive about its identity. And that defensiveness gets played out on the lives of women. And women have lesser and lesser negotiating space than within communities. And especially like Muslim women will be told, okay, it's your identity or your, kind of thing. So, so why? We don't want anybody to be in that. Okay? That's not the point. We are not trying to foist any one identity on anyone. We want simple justice in a very simple way. Okay, so I think that is where we came from. So that is where we were looking at, an optional civil code, which replaces not only personal laws but also custom. And then the guidelines for such a code, he said, was uniformity where it is a must, veriformity where it's advisable, retention. Anyway, that's, I think it was a very legal kind of a structure that he. As far as the groups, as far as women's groups and, like groups that were working on the ground with Adivasis, with different things, we went back to saying, okay, fine, the legal thing has become so vitiated now. Anyway, we have to get back to the process of trying to get justice for women on the ground, right? So we started working with community structures. Okay, however patriarchal they are. Like I said, the courts are patriarchal, you have patriarchy in the communities also. So we started working with Jamaats, we started working with Adivasi, councils. I remember sitting in panchayats, which were done. I worked with Adivasi communities. So I used to sit with, doing panchayats, with where, women were not even allowed in this thing, but they would allow me to come. So I said, am I not a woman? How are you seeing me as, somehow special? So, so these are the kind of engagements that you also kind of need to do to understand and to engage and to empathize also. It's not to kind of just in one stroke kind of say everything is, patriarchal, because we tried a lot negotiating with these structures, which we tried negotiating not only with the families, we tried, as I said, structures of the community as well. Okay. And I think I would say, yes, I think across the country, groups were doing this, and there was some headway that was made in challenging these kind of attitudes and practices, to the extent that, women from within, like say the Christian communities, women from within Muslim communities, they started taking the initiative also to bring reform from within, because that was also one, strand of the women's movement, saying that let's not try to bring change from outside, which is problematic because it's hegemonic, and we should try to bring change from within, which is more natural, which is more organic, which is more negotiated, which will give women more power. It's not that you're empowering somebody from outside, but you're trying to create space for the women to negotiate for their own, kinds of justice where they are located, because not women are not willing to give up on their community identities. Okay, that was one very huge lesson that we learned. That women, you can't say women and think that all women are going to come together. No. So, women are located, they have different layers of identity, and we have to engage. It's a practical thing. Like I said, it's not ideological, it's a practice. You have to engage with it. So that is what we did. And I think we did it as, groups that were not, any faith-based groups, but I think even Christian women's groups did a lot. They brought about changes in the Indian Divorce Act, which was very regressive. So they brought about changes. You had, organizations in the Muslim community like the Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan, who did, in fact, because of this whole Shaira Banu judgment that came, criminalized triple talaq. Actually, it made void triple talaq, which, then subsequently became criminalized. And so that didn't come about because of the government. It was not the government that, it was because, BMMA really worked hard on the ground with women. They did a huge survey, and they did a huge campaign to say that we want, this whole practice of polygamy to be, we don't want it. Please declare it as null and void, because it is affecting a lot of women. So that voice came from within the women's movement. And of course, the claim was taken, unfortunately, by the government. But I think so there were groups, so women's groups from within different communities tried to bring about these changes. And so also Adivasi groups, yes, even today you say that Adivasi groups are kept out of, and I don't understand this logic. I mean, you want to bring in a uniform civil code, and you bring it in Uttarakhand, but you leave the Adivasis out of it. So then you would know that this is not a genuine attempt to kind of, bring about gender justice or anything. It is you're making a political point. Okay, you're scoring a political point. It's very clear. So, so you leave out the Adivasis. Now, what is happening is that, the way, there is questioning within the, even in the Adivasi, while there is the Adivasi identity, which is very strong, And there are some very positive kind of practices, customary practices that are there within Adivasi communities, because Adivasis have very different notions of gender and, property and everything. Like, for example, in Arunachal, it's common, it's community owned property. You don't have individual property. So, so it's every tribe has its own kind of rules and norms and things. But I think within also the women are kind of speaking out to say there are some practices which are patriarchal, where we are not getting what we want, whether it's in terms of property or whether it's in terms of, some relief, matrimonial relief, we're not getting it because, so there is that kind of a pushback which is also there. So I think we have to try a combination of, all of this. Like I said, it can't be just a legal solution, but it has to be something which is more rooted and grounded and empathetic, to these multiple realities.
No, thanks a lot. Because the reason why I sort of asked is because my first engagement with this was, I think, the Supreme Court's judgment in Madhu Kishwar versus State of Bihar, where an attempt at maybe trying to use the legal channels to get an Adivasi woman her right to land from her family, I wouldn't say backfired, but forced a rethink by someone who was leading that campaign, who was Madhu Kishwar, who said, hang on, the community here is like, wait, are you going to force us to become Hindu now? And they didn't identify themselves as Hindu. They didn't want the Hindu law to apply to them. And you see that, and she writes a very long article in Manushi for this, where she's now forced to grapple with, I think, some of, and exactly what I think Madhu Bhushan pointed out, that, we need this kind of ground up kind push for reform rather than a top down state driven effort for this. And because that's perhaps that accounts for some of the diversity, maybe try and answer the question as succinctly as possible. Is uniformity necessary for justice? So, Raag, maybe just quickly your thoughts. I'm not letting you get away without answering the question.
Repeat the question.
Is uniformity, at least in the context of personal laws, family laws, is it necessary for justice?
No. You can have a just and plural religious legal order without it being necessarily uniform. I think there are good arguments for having a uniform system simply because we can have something that is fair, that is just, that is easy to administer, and these are values that are worth considering. Second point I'll quickly make is that the difference between means and ends. Whatever is the end that we employ, especially in matters that are as culturally sensitive, unless the means are similarly sensitive, like Madhu said, any action getting to the right end will have a counterintuitive consequence. You'll end up angering, isolating people more, creating more distrust in communities. And so this is one of those things where maybe a firm political hand is required. I am not suggesting that you leave it entirely up to cultural rejuvenation, but there are limits to what can be imposed in this particular scenario. And the final point that I'll just make is you mentioned justice, you mentioned uniformity, you didn't mention religion, which I think is the core issue here. There was this wonderful French author, Charles Piguet, wrote this lovely book in 1909 called Our Youth, and begins the book by saying everything begins with mysticism and ends with politics. And I think that is a good summation of what we have seen with this personal law debate.
Thanks a lot, Raag. And likewise, Madhu, is uniformity necessary for justice?
I think in a way I've already answered
But just
it.
maybe summarizing.
Yeah, what I would say is where we are today. I mean, if I go back to what we think needs to be done, in terms of going forward, is that we are in the process. Actually, we've started a whole process of, putting together what we would call code, a gender just code, from all our experience, of engaging with issues of, whatever, marriage, matrimony, etc., etc. We and the issues that have been raised by the gender minority groups and by Muslim women's groups, all of us put together, we thought we should drop some kind of a gender equality code, that could become the kind of, that would address specific rights, not give this omnibus kind of a thing, but address specific rights related to marriage, custody, divorce, maintenance, alimony. So there would be principles, they would not be like, say, okay, this is the law that should be there and that is how that law will be implemented. No, we're saying this, there should be a gender just code that can become a kind of a thing for reform, both within personal and secular laws, And I could just quote here the principles that would underlie this code. I quote Dr. Pam Rajput, she was on the high-level committee on the status of women in India. She chaired this, and they brought out a report in June 2015, in which the report says the approach should not be one of ensuring that there is one law for all, but rather that all women, whether they choose to be governed by secular laws or their personal laws, enjoy equality which the Indian Constitution promises them. This requires addressing several aspects in the legal domain in specific ways rather than a diktat of uniformity which is conceived of in fundamentalist or majoritarian ways. And the report also notes that there's a need to address discrimination not only de jure but also de facto, which necessitates states to adopt laws, policies, and practices and undertake proactive measures and affirmative action in order to obliterate these discriminatory practices and problems. So for us, that is the principle, as I said, for any kind of justice, that we want to see happening on the ground.
Thank you so much. And please do join me in giving a round of applause to our speakers, Raag and Madhu.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you liked what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review on Apple Podcast or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is S. Sarvana Raj and Ranjit Kumar on sound supervision and production. Artwork is designed by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Sunaina Jain signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.